So the whole idea of using skits is the idea of creating context for your listeners so they keep engaged with the story and keep wanting to know what's going to happen next. Yo, what's up? Welcome to the 29th episode of the Resolution Podcast, where we help rappers gain clarity on their calling. I'm your host with the most, Alex Lacey. And this week, we're going to be talking about how to make your next album incredible and how to really bridge the gaps between the songs themselves. And it is a way that I am starting to see a lot of albums kind of die out and not use as much, nearly as much in the 90s. It was like, it peaked in the 90s. And that was the use of skits. Basically, little bits of audio between each song that kind of link each one to the next. So I listed out a bunch of examples here of artists that have used skits in their albums, and they're pretty much all classic albums. I mean, they're all albums that I love. We have Tribe Called Quest, Midnight Marauders, and they have the radio voice talking about, I can't even remember what they were saying. I can't remember any of the phrases it was saying, but it was basically talking about just like, we are going to bless your ears with certain frequencies you may find desirable. I think that was one phrase, but I can't remember exactly. The next one was Slum Village in their album Fantastic Volume 2, and it was phone calls in between each one, which you'll see in a minute that was a pretty big trend in the 90s as well. Gangstar, Moment of Truth, that was also phone calls in between each song. Like, for example, there was one where DJ Premier got a call from a guy who's like, yo, are you headed to the airport? He's like, yeah. And he's like, Guru got knocked. And he's like, what? And so, I mean, you could tell it was kind of scripted. And then that kind of leads into the next song of like what happened to Guru and what's going on with him. And then Outkast and Stankonia, Stankonia with the Alien Radio skits. The Far Side in Lab Cabin, California, which has my favorite song ever on there, and that's Runnin'. And that's basically, they were all just kind of, the one that I'm thinking about specifically is Groupie Therapy, which is the one right before Runnin', which has an incredible transition. I love that transition into Runnin'. But it just has them all just kind of hanging out, watching TV, and they stopped on an ad that was like, are you one of these that are caught up on these groupie people? Well, I'm Dr. R. So funny. From the Industry Institute, we're here for you. We've been there. Call this number at the bottom of your screen. And Mobb Deep, the infamous Prodigy, has an audio where he's talking about like, yo, I'm like a little skinny kid, but it's all about who gets who's first. You know what I'm saying? So it's basically that, and then that's kind of like the introduction to the album. And then later in the album, there's like audio of like, yo, toss the heat. It's like throwing away the gun so they don't get caught with it. And then Tupac has in his strictly for my homies, I'm not going to say the actual word, but he basically had in the song Last Words, there was I guess multiple instances in this album. He has like audio from a cop chasing like a black person. In one moment, he's like, yo, freeze, and like, stop running. And then the other one is like, any last words? Which is like very sad. Police brutality is awful. But that's the audio that he used to kind of mesh songs together throughout the extent of that album. And so those are all just like old school examples. So that was Tribe Called Quest, Midnight Marauders, Slum Village, Fantastic Volume 2, Gangstar, Moment of Truth, Outkast, Stankonia, The Far Side, Lab Cabin, California, Mobb Deep, The Infamous, and Tupac, Strictly for My Homies. And some new examples I only found were Kendrick Lamar, interestingly enough, which if you know of any new albums or newer albums that have those skits in between songs to kind of just bring the whole thing together, leave them in the description below. If you're on YouTube, if you're on Apple Music or Spotify, just go to YouTube, I guess, and leave it in the description. I'll leave a link to all of my socials. I need to start doing that anyway, just leaving a link to everything everywhere. But anyway, Kendrick Lamar is the only artist that I know of that has used skits in between songs. Consistent, like not necessarily just sparse, but because J. Cole has done that. He's just had like a couple instances of audio clips in one song, but not another song, or in one song, but the majority of them he just doesn't. But in Good Kid, Mad City, Good Kid, Mad City by Kendrick Lamar has basically had phone calls with his mom all running pretty much all the way through it. I think he might have skipped a couple songs, but basically all the way through it is a phone call from his mom, which is kind of an ode to the classic albums in the 90s where a lot of the dialogue was phone calls. Like, I guess it's only like 3 that had phone calls in the 90s, and that was Slum Village, Fantastic Volume 2, Gangstar, Moment of Truth, and then The Far Side, Lab Cabin, California. But it was still a pretty prominent theme of just having phone calls used as skits throughout the album. And then To Pimp a Butterfly, that's where he kind of veers off. He still has skits, but he veers off. It's just a poem. So he kind of reads each stanza, I guess you could call it a stanza, but each part of it as the part of the album, and then each part breaks into a song. So if you want to look at To Pimp a Butterfly, To Pimp a Butterfly is just a huge poem, but each stanza has its own song. At the end, we realize that he's talking to Tupac and that he's reading the whole thing to Tupac. So it ends up just being a conversation with him, which is, when I first heard that album, my mind was blown. I was like, yo, Tupac is on this album? Like, what the hell is going on here? So just having something, it doesn't even have to be a skit, but just having something to bring all of your songs together to form a full, complete project is a really powerful way to just keep your listener going on to the next song. So the whole idea of using skits is the idea of creating context for your listeners so they keep engaged with the story and keep wanting to know what's going to happen next. And using the idea of context can be expanded into creating basically your own universe. In which, what do I mean by that? I'm thinking of, when I was writing the script for this podcast, I was thinking, well, what are some really fundamental, I guess, no, not fundamental, but classic stories that first of all grip us and just keep us wanting to know more, but also have created and expanded their story into other facets and can be told from other perspectives. And my first thought was Star Wars. Because think about, it started with one film, and that was A New Hope. And then it turned into a trilogy. And then in the late 90s and early 2000s, it was given prequels. And then later in like 2015? I was in high school. It was one of my high school years, but it was late 2010s where they started doing the trilogy sequel to it. So it ended up being 9 films just starting from this one. And now we're getting shows like A New Hope, or no, not A New Hope, excuse me, The Mandalorian and Andor. And then we're getting other spin-off movies like Rogue One and Solo. Like, there's so many. They're taking all of these different things and they're creating even more. They've created like cartoons like the Clone Wars. They've basically created so many different versions of way to tell that story from different perspectives that you're able to basically be fully immersed in this whole universe because it has its own basically historical accounts. You can tell when certain things have happened in relation to other major events. And you could also extend this, context, this is a very vague and broad idea. One way is using it, basically tying it to events in the history of your career and transitioning into another instance that happened in your career that happened as a result of this one. You could also put your songs in the context of other albums or artists. All context really is just having a reference point and then referencing that reference point. That's all it is. So if you're able to do that, then it blows up your story to something that is so much bigger and so much more layered and so much more complicated and just in depth. Again, that's not something that's really happening right now. So if you really want to stand out, just add more context to your albums, and it'll make people go from fans to super fans because everybody loves to feel included in a very exclusive way. There you go. That's all I have for this podcast. Thank you so much for watching. And if you have any other ideas for podcasts that you want to see in the future, just hit me a DM on Instagram. My Instagram is alex.lacy, Lacy. A lot of people get that wrong. Or just leave a comment below and I will read it and respond. And again, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you not next week, but the week after. So have a great week, y'all. Peace.